Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the battle lines being drawn between Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson as Sunak fires back with what appears to be a little blackmail threat, as the Mail on Sunday now seems to regard Boris Johnson, their former golden boy, as their enemy. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So both Johnson and Sunak are getting increasingly desperate as the COVID public inquiry gets ready for the phase where actually it really goes public, where the incredibly damaging revelations will either be re-examined under a harsher public spotlight, maybe even come to light for the first time. A couple of weeks ago, when the Cabinet Office passed on Johnson's pandemic diaries to the police as evidence of hitherto uninvestigated law-breaking, Johnson seemed to threaten those involved by saying, I know things, I know things. It'd be a shame if anything had to come out, because I'm not the only one in the frame. Which looks to me like an attempt to use blackmail to derail a potential criminal investigation. But now Rishi Sunak seems to be dabbling in a little bit of blackmail himself. As I've previously discussed, Boris Johnson has offered to hand over some government records directly to the head of the inquiry, Baroness Hallett, completely bypassing the Cabinet Office. Now, Tory skip-fire politics aside, this is not appropriate. I said in the very first video which I did on this latest scandal that Johnson should not be passing information directly to the inquiry because there may need to be things redacted for genuine reasons. Not as much as the government want to redact, because they want to redact things, that are putting ministers in a bad light. But there might be actual things that need redaction for genuinely sensitive information. And it's not just my argument. The government rules are quite clear. The records which Boris Johnson is in possession of are government property. That includes his WhatsApp messages. They're not Johnson's, even though he made them. A little bit like, something you produce at work. You might have produced it, but it belongs to the company, your employer, unless you have some special arrangement. But Boris Johnson never was one for the rules because he has never suffered genuinely negative consequences for his misdeeds. The worst that's ever happened to him is got a little bit butthurt in some way. So waving government regulations in front of Johnson's nose isn't really going to work. So Sunak is now hitting him where it hurts, in his wallet. Reports this weekend, in fact the Sunday Times, suggest that the government has warned Johnson that the public funding for his legal team might evaporate if the former Prime Minister fails to obey the rules. Sort of a case of, that's a lot of public money you're getting for your expensive lawyers. I mean, £250,000 already, and looking like £1 million before very long. Be a shame if it were to suddenly stop. Oh, and after you've splashed out all those millions on a new mansion as well. So we seem to be watching threats and counter-threats from the current and former Prime Minister, just in case we don't look ridiculous enough on the world stage. But it raises another issue. The public have not really been impressed with the huge costs of Johnson's lawyers. The public are never impressed with what appears to be large sums of public money being spent on things it's like, well, it shouldn't even be needed. If the government, after all, didn't break the law, they wouldn't need expensive lawyers all the time, would they? That's £250,000. And reported to go up to £1 million for someone who isn't even in a civil case, or sort of in a personal case, I should say, who wouldn't qualify for legal aid. And now he's sacked his government lawyers. It's gonna that fee is going to go up a lot because he wants to engage lawyers privately, which piles on the price. But the argument was always that Johnson was using the lawyers to defend his work as a member of the government. Still seemed excessive, the amounts. But that was the justification. It's just like if you were to be sued for something you did in your work, you would expect your business to provide the legal representation. So in other words, Johnson had a statutory right to that legal advice. Now, it could still be argued he didn't necessarily have a right to the sheer expense of it, but that he did have a right to some suitable lawyers. But if Johnson is able to threaten to pull all future funding, doesn't that suggest that Johnson doesn't have a statutory right after all? I mean, which is it? Does Johnson have the right to these lawyers? In which case, how can Sunak threaten to withdraw funding? Or does he not? If Johnson is being given these expensive lawyers because Sunak has allowed it, isn't this just another case of Tory waste? Because the public don't want him to have it. As far as they're concerned, he's a multimillionaire, paid for himself. You know, we're less than 2 weeks away from the inquiry starting public hearings. Sunak and Johnson are clearly so stressed by the prospect, they're already trying to make sure that the public are focusing their attention on one rather than the other as being chiefly to blame. Johnson is endeavouring to make himself look open and honest by saying he wants to hand over relevant information, even though he has no intention of doing so. It absolutely plays into Johnson's hands to have Sunak block him from doing so, because then he could say, well, I tried to do the right thing, but that snake Sunak, he blocked me, you see. He blocked me. There I was, tried to be cooperative. If I'd still been the Prime Minister, this inquiry would be run completely transparently, absolutely open and honest. Which is not remotely true, of course. If Johnson was still PM, he'd have expected to have made sure that nothing incriminating ever came to light. Whether he'd been able to do so is another matter, but he'd have been as obstructive as Sunak without question. And this row between Sunak and Johnson, coupled with the inquiry which will steadfastly continue to investigate, clearly has the capacity to cause enormous damage to the Conservatives. How can I be so sure? Because the Mail on Sunday appears to have declared Boris Johnson public enemy number 2, after Keir Starmer, of course. The Mail was the natural supporter of Boris Johnson for some years. Oh, they loved his chaotic misadventures. It helped them sell their papers and distracted everyone from the way he was enabling the super wealthy to rob the country blind. But they are ultimately a paper who fears a Labour government, and especially fears a very strong Labour government. They need to get behind their party and have decided that Boris Johnson is a barrier to that progress. There is no way that Johnson comes back to lead the party before the election. Anyone wanting to help the Conservatives either win next year, or if you don't believe that's possible, at least limit the damage for a serious push the following election, needs to back Sunak. And if Johnson wants to engage in a fight to the death with Sunak, that also means opposing Johnson. Dan Hodges, the Mail's main political shill, has written a piece exposing Johnson as a gaslighter, doing nothing more than attempting to damage the government out of spite. The article points out that Johnson is not offering to hand over relevant records at all, but offering to hand over irrelevant documents whilst using threats and coercion in order to prevent the actual relevant documents being handed over. After all, look at the stink he made when his diaries were handed over to the police. Hodges describes how the government asked Johnson for the supposedly locked mobile phone in January. In order to safely remove the content, Johnson refused. Frankly, he's got no legal right to refuse. If the government really wanted it, they can take legal action. They can get that phone. I wonder if the inquiry will take legal action to get the phone, because Johnson has no rights to retain it. It's clearly one of the most important sources of information relevant to the inquiry. The information on the phone is government property. It's quite possible the phone itself is government property. It's certainly the source of information of most public interest, even though the public may not be able to see all the contents for themselves. But important that the inquiry has access to it. And if you are in any doubt about the Mail's position here, not only does the article really tear into Johnson, it defends Sunak against the indefensible. For example, Hodges argues that Sunak is right to stop Johnson handing over the information directly to the inquiry on 2 counts. First, because of genuine national security concerns. This is fine, absolutely true. But second, he says the government have a right to stop the disclosure of unambiguously irrelevant information. This is not true. Or more accurately, it is for the inquiry to judge whether it is relevant and what is irrelevant. If it's irrelevant, they just won't pursue it. It's fine. It's not for the accused. And although this inquiry is not a criminal investigation, the government are effectively a defendant in the proceedings. You would not let someone being investigated by the police decide what evidence they could and could not hand over. You hand it all over and you let the police and the prosecutors decide what's relevant. The article ends up, after a brief bit of positive reporting on Hallett for the sake of pretend balance, attacking the inquiry for its terms of reference. Terms of reference, I'll remind people, which were agreed by the government and approved of by the public. But Hodges claims that the terms are too wide, you see. It should be more narrowly focused on the lessons needed to better prepare for the next pandemic. Now, that sounds fine, but what he really means is conducts the inquiry from the point of view that ministers all did their very best under trying circumstances and that any missteps were inadvertent, genuine mistakes. But not only do we know from earlier investigations and judicial reviews that this is not true, it is not something you can just assume anyway. and ask yourself why the Mail would turn on its former friend Boris Johnson so savagely, but also attack the inquiry itself. Because the Mail hasn't suddenly started to report on the news. It's doing what it always does, trying to persuade its readers to act in a way which is in the interest of its owner, which is not in the interest of its readers. But the Mail has been increasingly out of step with the public over the past year or so. It has continued to back causes that are just not working. It's fighting a desperate rearguard action in the last days of a Conservative government. But it has no power to prevent the very damaging infighting which is taking place in the Tory party, and can only get worse as the public start paying more attention to the inquiry. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.